The night was alive with music, laughter and the joy of the Olympics, a global celebration of unity and peace. Then a deafening blast through Centennial Park. It sent shards of metal and chaos into the crowd. Lives were lost. Hundreds were injured and the world's sense of safety was shattered in a moment of devastation. But what no one knew was that this was just the beginning. This is Red Rum. Stories about the true victims of crime. I upload 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week, so make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. I use news archives, documentary footage and books to research these cases, so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. Let's go back to the 17th of July 1996. The Summer Olympics were in full swing in Atlanta, Georgia. The city was alive with excitement and Centennial Park was buzzing with thousands of visitors enjoying a free late night concert. The band Jack Mack and the Heart Attack were performing and the area was packed with spectators who were just kind of enjoying this warm summer night. In the middle of the crowd, a security guard was doing his job. Richard wasn't your average guard. He took his role seriously. Maybe a little bit too seriously in some people's eyes. He was the kind of guy who dreamed of being a law enforcement officer, but his career hadn't exactly gone as planned. He'd bounced between security gigs and law enforcement jobs, often clashing with supervisors who thought, if anything, he was extremely eager in his work. But Richard didn't really see himself as just a security guard. He saw himself as a protector. Richard was stationed near the sound tower, a key vantage point, and as he scanned the bustling crowd, his eyes soon landed on something a little bit unusual. It was a green backpack and it was just sitting on the ground underneath a bench. At first glance, it might not have seemed like much, maybe just a forgotten bag, but Richard's gut told him that something wasn't right. He'd been trained to be suspicious of unattended items, especially during a high-profile event like the Olympics. Richard approached the backpack, and as he got closer, he just pointed it out to a person nearby who was a Georgia Bureau investigator, or GBI as they're known. That person agreed that it was suspicious, and so they alerted the bomb disposal unit and just waited for their arrival. While they were waiting, however, Richard wasn't just going to stand there. He acted. He started clearing the area from around the bench. One by one, he moved people back away from that area, convincing them to relocate to a safer spot. And many people were hearing his words, but they didn't really understand the urgency of this. But he wasn't going to panic. He wasn't going to cause more chaos. So instead, he just kind of used his authority as a security guard to try and diffuse any tension that was building up. This wasn't like a film scene with dramatic music and screaming crowds. It was reported as being quite a steady effort to just basically create a buffer between this suspicious looking bag and the public. Meanwhile, the GBI officer is calling for backup and other members of security begin to help trying to clear the area. That is when police officers who had soon arrived and volunteers started to rope off a perimeter around the area. But the crowd didn't entirely disperse. After all, it was a concert. Many people just assumed that this was a precaution or some kind of false alarm. The bomb squad then arrived. It was relatively quick for them to get there, and the technicians began to examine the bag. Now, inside, they found this large kind of military-style backpack, and of course, at this point, they don't know that there's necessarily anything harmful inside, but they are just taking all of the necessary precautions. And as they see this military-style backpack, they start to worry a little bit. They think that it is very suspicious and this could potentially be something extremely dangerous. The bomb squad then used a robot to get a more accurate determination of what was inside. What they found was chilling. Inside the bag, there were 3 pipe bombs. And each of these pipe bombs had been surrounded by nails and screws, obviously designed to cause maximum harm and damage. Of course, by this point, the team realised that this is just going to be a race against time for them. The bomb could go off at any minute. They really now needed to evacuate this larger group of people who were gathering around the area. Alongside this, they needed to defuse the bomb before it detonated and injured, or of course potentially killed one of the many people who were standing by, or one of the bomb technicians. But they did not have the time that they so desperately needed. Just moments later, at 1:20 a.m, the bomb detonated. The blast was deafening. It sent shrapnel and debris flying through the air. The people who were in the immediate radius were thrown to the ground. And of course, many of them were injured by the nails and by the screws. A Turkish cameraman who had come to report on what was happening suffered a fatal heart attack. Altogether, 111 people were struck and suffered injuries, but one of them was fatally wounded. Alice Hawthorne, who was just 44 years old at the time of the bombing. She was at the concert with one of her daughters, 14-year-old Fallon. Fallon was injured, but she did survive. Sadly, Alice didn't. The pair had been to the concert to celebrate Fallon's 14th birthday, and Alice's eldest daughter, Adoria Minor, had planned to join them, but she had to work instead. Alice was known as a devoted mother, a community leader, and she was an entrepreneur as well. She was described in the source material as exuding warmth and grace. The loss of those two lives was, of course, devastating, but the initial reaction was that it could have been much worse. Richard's action in spotting that bag and acting very quickly, moving people away, that had meant that countless lives were saved, and it was all thanks to him. Without his vigilance, dozens more could have been injured and potentially killed. In those initial hours, Richard was hailed as a hero. The authorities really commended his quick thinking, his quick actions, and he was absolutely praised in the media that came out initially following the attack. And for Richard, this was probably some kind of validation for his efforts. Maybe all those years of being seen as too intense or too eager were finally worth it. But within days, whispers started circulating. The FBI received a tip from the Chief of Piedmont College Police Department, which is where Richard used to work. The chief told the FBI that Richard had shown this really unusual interest in law enforcement. And on top of this, he owned books about bomb making. Just 3 days after the bombing, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution published this story that suggested that Richard was a suspect. With this, the media quickly changed their tune and they ran with it. Reporters even camped outside where Richard was living at the time, and he was living with his mum. And these reporters had headlines that plastered Richard's face everywhere and labelled him as the prime suspect. People started calling him a wannabe cop who had planted this bomb just so that he could save the day. The FBI's theory was that the person who finds the bomb is often the person who has planted the bomb. Profilers suggested that the bomber might be someone who was really seeking attention, a quote lone wolf type who wanted to play the hero. And Richard, with his over-eager reputation, he really fit that profile perfectly. The FBI did bring Richard in for questioning, but at first they told him it was something else. It was under the pretense of recording this kind of training video. Of course it wasn't, and it very quickly became clear that they were trying to get him to admit to the crime. Richard was stunned and confused, and he insisted that he was innocent, but the investigation did not stop there. Agents searched his home and they combed through every inch of his belongings, and reporters filmed all of this happening. But even though the FBI were investigating Richard, he was never formally arrested. They just didn't have the evidence, but this didn't really seem to matter. His life by this point had become an absolute spectacle. Richard was questioned as though he'd done it. The FBI seemed to think so, the public and the media certainly did, and generally the public was viewing him with this kind of certain suspicion. The speculation that Richard wanted to be this hero led to this kind of trial by media that devastated his reputation and his mental health. It wasn't until October 1996, so 88 days after the whole ordeal began, that the US Justice Department officially cleared him of any involvement in the bombing. Unfortunately though, by then, the damage had been done. And meanwhile, the bomber remained free. And over the next 7 years, he would cause irreversible damage and pain to a lot of people. And he'd do this mainly through the planting and detonation of even more bombs. It was 6 months later, in January 1997, that an employee at the Women's Health Care Centre in Georgia, this employee was called Patricia, and she settled into her desk to have her day of work. And seemingly out of nowhere, there was this blast, and it was huge. It was powerful enough to shatter windows. It even blew out a section of the wall. Patricia heard panic and confusion that then morphed into screams of pain and fear. She looked around and realised that people were bleeding, people were hurt. It turned out that they had suffered shrapnel wounds from a bomb. Patricia herself was caught in the blast, and the explosion caused serious injuries, but miraculously she did survive. Her injuries included shrapnel wounds to her leg and some severe bruising as well. She was one of several people who were hospitalised after the bombing, but she, like many of the other survivors, had a really long road to recovery. The authorities that were called in to examine the scene quickly determined that the design of the bomb involved this kind of pressure cooker style pipe bomb. It had been packed with nails and other fragments to increase the likelihood of real damage. That bombing injured over 50 people, and in a horrific add-on to this already awful event, a second bomb was found by law enforcement. This one was found about an hour after the initial bombing, and it was concluded that this was one that was targeted especially and specifically to emergency services who would be responding to the disaster. Now, fortunately, they did manage to locate this bomb in time. The bomb squad managed to detonate it safely, and no one else was injured as a result of that. But it clearly showed the intent of the perpetrator. It was to cause as much damage as humanly possible. Fast forward to a month later, and we're at the Other Side Lounge in Atlanta. It was a popular gay bar. It was known by locals and even people who would come from out of town because it had this really inclusive atmosphere. Everyone was welcome. On this particular evening, the bar was filled with people drinking, people dancing, and just generally trying to enjoy their night out. It was around 1:30 a.m. that morning that a bomb exploded. It was just outside the bar that the bomb was placed, and 5 people were injured, and the bomb itself caused really bad damage to the actual building structure. It left a huge hole in the front of the bar, and the destruction itself was terrifying. There was obviously a lot of panic and screaming after that initial explosion. People were running, they were really trying to get away from the attack, kind of stumbling over each other, but somehow no one was actually killed, but there were, of course, injuries. When the emergency services arrived, the bomb disposal unit found another bomb. Just like in the previous attack, this second bomb was designed to target emergency workers. Thankfully, again, they managed to disarm the bomb safely and no one was injured beyond this. But now there was a real sense of fear mounting amongst people for various different reasons. That bomb had gone off at a healthcare clinic, an abortion clinic, and this second one had gone off at a gay club. So people who were gay, bisexual, trans, queer, they were incredibly worried about what was going to happen. And the FBI were no closer to discovering who this perpetrator was. With all that suspicion that had been on Robert back with the Summer Olympics bombing, they knew they couldn't just jump into accusing anyone else without some real solid evidence. And then, just under a year later, the final and most fatal attack happened. It was on the 29th of January 1998 that this nurse, Emily Lyons, she was working her usual shift at the New Women All Women Healthcare Clinic. It's an abortion clinic that is in Birmingham, Alabama. Emily had been a nurse at this abortion clinic for a number of years, and well, I'd like to say back in the 90s, but I fear as we take a giant step backwards, this is probably the case in many places today too. Emily was used to the risks of working at an abortion clinic, from verbal abuse and threats to physical violence as well. But anyway, this bomb had been placed outside the clinic, as we'd seen in some of the previous attacks, and it was a nail-packed pipe-type explosive designed to maximise damage. This was most similar in type to the one that was placed at the Summer Olympics concert. This bomb exploded at around 10:30 a.m. and the blast was so powerful that it actually blew out windows and it caused severe damage to the clinic's interior as well. The bomb had been placed in a public area near the entrance, and the intention was very clearly to harm as many people as possible. At the time of the explosion, Emily was treating patients inside the clinic. The bomb shattered her body with its blast, including injuring her leg quite severely. The injuries she got in the explosion were life-threatening, and so emergency services arrived and she and a number of other people were rushed to hospital. Her injuries were so bad that doctors said initially they didn't know if she was going to survive at all. The bomb had torn through her leg and it caused internal injuries. She later said that the pain was indescribable and the blast left her with lasting physical and emotional scars. Over the following few years, Emily had to undergo numerous surgeries and rehabilitation. Despite the trauma though, she really did remain resilient and committed to helping others. Even after her own life had been dramatically flipped upside down after that attack, she decided that she was going to have her main goal was to help. The impact of the bomb though did not end with Emily's injuries. A police officer who had been working as a security guard at the clinic that day, Robert Sanderson, he was also struck when the bomb exploded and his injuries were fatal. There's a memorial page set up for Robert, who was nicknamed Sandy by his friends and by his family. And honestly, it's pretty heartbreaking. I'll leave a link in the description box below if you want to go and read it, but prepare yourself. It really gives you an idea of the kind of person he was. Quote, Sandy taught me how to fuse street knowledge with law enforcement and police a community that really didn't want to be policed. I'm grateful to this day for Sandy. I owe my law enforcement accolades and accomplishments to Officer Robert Sandy Sanderson. Sandy was a really fun person to be around. Great attitude, great conduct, and very compassionate with criminals. I once saw him take off his jacket and put it on a cold, handcuffed juvenile offender. I hope that he is always remembered. And what we will get to shortly is the written confession from the bomber. But I wanted to quote now what he said about this part of the attack. He incorrectly refers to people as killers when he's talking about employees of the abortion clinic. Quote, the object was to target the doctor killer, but because the device was prematurely discovered by the security guard, it had to be detonated with only the assistant killers in the target area. So this is when it was detonated and Sandy was ultimately killed. These bomb attacks, these murders, completely devastated the local communities. And the problem was that progress on the investigation front was relatively slow. But things were moving forward, at least a little bit. Investigators were analysing forensic evidence alongside witness accounts to try and determine who was responsible. One of the key breakthroughs came from the bomb materials themselves. Investigators discovered materials that were similar in composition at the Sandy Springs clinic and in the other attacks, and so they could then link them together. The consistency in bomb construction and the actual materials, the metal fragments that were found, they pointed to a single person or a single group behind the attacks. And this is when the investigation really propelled forward. Investigators spoke to people who had sold these items, witnesses, and they gave descriptions of this man. And there were also 2 witnesses who had observed a man departing the final bombing scene. And not only had they been able to give a clear visual description of him, but they also took his truck's number plate down. And so when the police looked into that and looked at who it belonged to, they found out that it belonged to a man called Eric Robert Rudolph. Alongside this, they were also looking into the explosive materials used, and these included dynamite and pipe bomb casings. They were distinctive, and forensic experts managed to give specific details. Investigators then went round visiting local stores and managed to match these items to specific purchases made in the area, and some of these store owners or employees managed to describe the man in question, and he fit the description of Eric. We looked further into Eric and his background. They soon discovered that not only had he had access to the bomb sites by being nearby, but his ideology on abortion and on LGBTQI rights and establishments was well known. And it certainly did fit with the profile that they now had of the bomber. The problem was that when they went to Eric's listed home address, they couldn't find him there. And then when they went to question his family, they said they didn't know where he was at either. And when they said this to officers, they also said that they were absolutely insistent that Eric had nothing to do with the bombings. They fully supported him. By the 5th of May 1998, Eric was officially listed as a fugitive on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. The FBI considered him to be armed and extremely dangerous, and they offered a $1 million reward for any information that would lead to his arrest. Now, just before he was put on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, Eric's older brother Daniel did something so extremely bizarre. I read this in the source material and I literally just sat there for a couple of minutes, like gobsmacked. I was so unsure of what I'd just read, but I've researched it and it is 100% true. Daniel went to his garage in South Carolina and he set up a video camera that he turned on to record himself. He then, into the camera, recited this kind of biblical verse, and then he used a radial saw to cut off his left hand, actually fully cut off his whole hand. He would say that this was supposed to be a protest against the FBI and the media's treatment of his brother. Daniel was immediately rushed to hospital and surgeons did manage to reattach his hand, which I think is kind of incredible. Daniel was so sure that his brother was innocent, or maybe, probably, there are a few other reasons why he might have done this actually. But either way, for him, it was a form of protest. His entire family were then placed under surveillance as it was believed that they might know where Eric was and just weren't saying anything. But on the flip side to this, Eric's younger brother Jamie, who was openly gay and was close with Eric, he gave an interview how he spoke about how Eric never said anything to him and his boyfriend at the time they were together. He admitted that he could have been thinking bad things and just not said anything, but either way, he was able to be out with them, out for dinner, and not do anything bad. This was a kind of polar opposite to Eric's views. Now, either way, Eric spent the next few years in the Appalachian wilderness as a fugitive, and there were searches by amateur search teams and also federal ones, but they could never locate him. Eric managed to live off-grid without being captured for years. That was until May 2003 when a police officer in Murphy, North Carolina saw a man looking behind a rubbish bin in a Save-A-Lot parking lot. It was around 4 a.m. and the police officer just happened to be on a routine patrol when he saw this man rifling through the bin. He suspected that some kind of burglary was taking place, and so he went up to the man and arrested him. It was only when he got him back to the police station that he realised who it was. They found various items that then became evidence, both in Eric's possession and also in a storage unit that he rented. These items linked him definitively to the bombings. There were things like bomb-making materials and receipts, and by 2005, Eric kind of knew the gig was up. He made a full confession. I have read the full confession and it is something. It is unbelievably obnoxious. I literally only need to quote one tiny section and I think you will understand what I mean. Quote, "The fact that I have entered an agreement with the government is purely a tactical choice on my part and in no way legitimates the moral authority of the government to judge this matter. I have no regrets or remorse for my actions that day in January and consider what happened morally justified." And actually, given where we're at in the current political climate and the overturning of Roe versus Wade, something that Eric speaks about specifically, I think is worth mentioning here. The next quote might be triggering, just fair warning. Quote, "Like other humans suffering from various disabilities, homosexual should not attempt to infect the rest of society with their particular illness." I really don't think I need to say much more, but there is so much more. I actually really regret reading the whole thing. I kind of had to, I suppose, but I did it so you don't have to. Of course, it's out there if you want to read it, but I don't recommend it. There are some more details that I've not included, but to be honest, it's just Eric mainly talking about himself and his thoughts in this kind of godlike way. And I'm just not really bothered to give this piece of shit any more time in this episode, if I'm honest. What I will talk about is what he was charged with. So Eric was charged with multiple counts of murder and bombings. And eventually he pleaded guilty to all charges. And him pleading guilty, that's how he avoided the death penalty. But alongside this, they made him give up locations of some hidden explosives that he'd planted all around North Carolina. What I wanted to end on today is where we started, with the wrongly accused Richard Jewell. He spent his life, after being accused, he spent his life really fighting for people who were wrongfully accused of crimes. But sadly, he passed away in 2007 at 44 years old. So here's the real legacy of Richard Jewell. He wasn't the bomber. He wasn't some wannabe police officer trying to get attention. He was exactly who he seemed to be. a man who wanted to protect others and who saved countless lives. But afterwards, he paid the ultimate price for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And unfortunately, because it took so long to find the real perpetrator, more people died. And as far as I can tell, Eric still holds the same views that he did back then now. Thank you for watching this episode of Red Rum. Today I wanted to recommend a book for you. Now, what you might not know about me is that I really love eating and I love the gym. I really enjoy learning about food. So this, again, might be a little bit niche. I am currently bulking, so I'm just trying to get really strong so I can fight off all the horrible murderers out there. My coach Jewell is very, very good. She really knows her stuff, especially when it comes to trying to gain muscle and sort of just feeling your best self, I suppose. I wanted to learn a bit more about what I was putting in my body food-wise, and I love learning about it. And I found this book. It is a deep dive into the science of eating well, and it talks about how food impacts our health. It talks about the gut microbiome, which is important, really important. It's quite a dense read, and it's only really going to be interesting to you if you find this stuff interesting, I think. If this stuff thrills you in the same way it does for me, hey, I've got thick bakes, I've got health. It's all about balance. I liked Tim Spector a lot. I listened to a couple of his podcasts. He had this has this Zoe podcast, it's called. And I listened to that before I read this. I find him really engaging. And he talks in evidence-based ways, and it's really accessible. It's not super wordy and jargony, which I like a lot. So anyway, that is my recommendation for today. Other than that, I will see you next week every time. I'll see you in a couple of days for a new episode of Red Rum. Bye.